The war had been won, but the men who forged the weapons were now locked in a colder, harder peace. It shuddered with the continuous guttural roar of the Edgar Thomson steelworks, a monstrous symphony of industry that devoured daylight and choked the sky with a perpetual cloud of red-brown soot. It was the winter of 1919, only months after the Great War's supposed end, but in this mill town along the Monongahela River, the fighting never truly ceased. It had merely shifted its battleground from the muddy trenches of Europe to the infernal floor of the open hearth furnace. The mill was a cathedral of American muscle and ambition, but to men like Janek Kowalski, it was a prison forged of the very steel they produced. He stood on the casting floor, a silhouette against the blinding, liquid white spill of molten iron. The heat was a physical enemy, a creature that clawed at his lungs, baked the sweat into his worn wool shirt, and dried the very moisture from his eyeballs. The air tasted of iron and sulfur, a metallic, acrid flavor that clung to the back of his throat and never truly left, even when he ate his meager supper in the dark. The grinding life. Janek was 28, but the mill had aged him a decade beyond his years. His face, usually a study in Slavic stoicism, was cross-hatched with lines etched by smoke and fatigue. His hands, powerful, scarred, and perpetually stained black, were the currency of his existence. He was one of the thousands of hunkies, or Polacks, as the foreman derisively called the workers from southern and eastern Europe, the raw, cheap fuel for Carnegie's colossal machine, now part of U.S. Steel. He had arrived in America 5 years prior, a Pole fleeing a homeland perpetually caught between great empires. He'd come seeking the golden promise of Wola, or freedom, advertised in pamphlets. A promise that had melted away like slag in the heat of the first blast furnace he saw. His dream of saving enough to buy a small farm in the New World had been pared down to the daily, desperate need for a few dollars to feed his wife, Zofia, and their 2 young children crowded into their tiny rented house on 5th Street, a house that smelled eternally of stale cabbage and mill dust. Janek's shift was 12 hours, 6 days a week, the infamous long turn of the steel industry. Today he was part of the crew charging the open hearth, shoving dolomite and scrap steel into the hungry maw of the furnace. It was a rhythmic, back-breaking dance with danger. A misplaced step, a burst of steam, a splash of metal, and a man became another name etched into the grim ledger of industrial accidents. They called it earning the heat. He knew men whose wives wore black not from the war, but from the accident of a broken cable or a collapsing scaffold. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of a leather glove. The foreman, a loud, ginger-haired Irishman named O'Malley, was barking orders in a stream of English that was just coherent enough for Janek to understand the impending threat. "Kowalski, move your arse. That ore needs to be in before the bell. This ain't no church picnic, you hear?" Janek didn't respond, a conscious choice born of pride and self-preservation. Any perceived insolence could cost him the shift, or worse, the job. He simply heaved a shovel load of calcined ore into the charging box, his muscles screaming a silent protest. He focused only on the motion, a mantra of survival. Push, heave, clear. Push, heave, clear. The seeds of tension. The tension in the mill was a live wire, humming with latent energy. The war had been an economic boom, demanding every ounce of steel they could pour, and for a time, wages had crept up. But now, with the contracts slowing, the owners, faceless, distant men in offices 1,000 miles away, were squeezing the vice. They talked of efficiency and readjustment, words that translated directly into increased production quotas, frozen wages, and a ruthless indifference to worker safety. The immigrant workers bore the brunt of this pressure. They were the most expendable, the least likely to complain, and in the prevailing nativist atmosphere of post-World War I America, they were often viewed with suspicion, branded as Bolsheviks or radicals who had brought their foreign diseases and their foreign politics to American soil. Janek was a man of simple faith and a desire for an honest day's pay for an honest day's labor. He had no love for the radical pamphlets that sometimes surfaced, hastily printed and passed in the shadows of the coke ovens. He only knew that the American dream felt increasingly like an American lie. The divide wasn't just between owner and worker, it was baked into the very hierarchy of the mill. At the top were the salaried managers and the skilled Anglo-Saxon workers, like the melters and roll hands, who held union cards in seniority. Below them were the unskilled common laborers, the great mass of immigrants, Slovaks, Croats, Hungarians, Italians, and Poles, who were paid less than half the skilled man's wage for work twice as dangerous. They were barred from the powerful unions and dismissed as a transient rabble. But the sheer injustice of it was beginning to weld them together, forging a new sense of common purpose. It was Piotr, a massive Slovakian with a gentle face and a missing finger lost to a conveyor belt, who first introduced Janek to the whispers of organization. Piotr worked the night shift in the slag pits, a job so miserable and hot it was reserved for the newest arrivals. "The owners," Piotr had whispered one evening, his voice raspy from the sulfur fumes. "They look at us and see only hands. They do not see men, only machines that eat cheap bread." He had gestured with his massive hand towards the towering, smoke-shrouded offices that overlooked the plant, a clean, quiet fortress, removed from the inferno. "They are strong because we are weak. We must speak with one voice. We must demand the three things: an 8-hour day, a living wage, and the right to the union." Janek had listened in silence, his heart a drum in his chest. Joining a union, which the company explicitly forbade, threatening immediate dismissal and a blacklisting across the valley, was an act of revolution. It was a risk that could not only cost him his job, but could also see him beaten by company guards, or worse, deported under the newly inflamed anti-foreigner laws. Yet every day he shoveled ore for 12 grueling hours, he saw the future fading, the last embers of his American dream cooling to ash. The whisper of a planned, massive, coordinated strike, a steel strike that would cripple the entire industry and finally force the hand of the owners, was spreading like fire through the tinder-dry wooden boarding houses of the immigrant quarter. It was a dangerous hope, a terrifying possibility. Would they rise? Would they find the courage to challenge the titans of American industry? The clang of the charging box hitting the furnace door jarred Janek back to the present. The metal shrieked, a sound of agony and immense power. O'Malley was staring at him, his mouth set in a thin, hard line. "Kowalski, I saw you looking toward the mill gate. Don't get getting ideas, you understand? There's agitators out there, communists. They'll take your dollar and ship you back to your potato patch. The mill is good to you. It feeds you. Keep your head down and your shovel moving." Janek met the foreman's eyes for a fleeting second, the heat of the furnace at his back. He gave a curt nod, a mask of compliance fixed firmly on his face. But in his heart a different kind of heat was rising, a slow, deep brun that had nothing to do with the molten iron. It was the heat of a decision being forged. The fire of the furnace was a tool of the owners, but the heat in the belly of the worker, that belonged to him. The fight was coming. It was a question of whether he would meet it with his shovel or with a union card clenched in his hand. The mill's roar was muffled but never silenced on 5th Street, the cramped, unpaved avenue where the immigrant families of Carnegie resided. It was a place of perpetually drawn shades and the faint, persistent odor of coal smoke and poverty. Janek arrived home late, the 12-hour shift a lead weight in his bones. The kitchen, the largest room in their 2-room house, was dimly lit by a single kerosene lamp. His wife, Zofia, was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread on a chipped wooden table.
She was 5 years his younger, but the hardships had carved a premature weariness into her delicate features, turning her eyes into deep pools of concern.
"You are late," she said, her voice soft but strained. She spoke in Polish, the language of their shared painful memory of home, reserving English for interactions outside the house. "O'Malley kept you?" Janek nodded, dropping his dinner pail heavily by the door. "Overtime. Another charge on Furnace 3. We worked the heat until our eyes burned." He lowered his voice. "He watches me, Sophia. He sees the others too, the ones who speak out." Sophia stopped kneading, her hands white with flour. "They are not watching you because you are a slow worker, Janek. They are watching you because you look at Piotr and Piotr looks at the socialist. They say the Pinkertons are here, everywhere, even in the church." The fear was palpable, a chilling counterpoint to the heat he'd just left. The Pinkertons, the company's private detectives, were notorious for violence, intimidation, and infiltrating any attempts at union organizing. They were the mill owner's answer to the rising tide of labor discontent. "The socialist speaks only of a fair wage, Janek," countered Janek, though his own certainty wavered. "He speaks of the 8-hour day. I have not seen our son, little Jurek, awake in 3 days. By the time I leave the mill, he is still sleeping. By the time I return, he is back in bed. Is this a life where a father knows his own son only by the shadows on his face?" His eyes settled on his daughter, Clara, a thoughtful 6-year-old, sleeping curled up on a cot beside the stove. The need to see her thrive, to spare her the grinding poverty of his youth, was his most powerful motivation. "They offered 25 cents more an hour, they take back 50 cents in rent and company store prices, and still they want you to risk your life for their profits? You must stay safe, Janek. We came here for a life, not a monument in the company graveyard." She put her flour-dusted hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Piotr has 3 children. If he is fired, they starve. If you are fired, we starve. The strike, it is a beautiful, dangerous thing. It is not our fight. Not yet." Janek turned away, shame burning brighter than the furnace he'd tended. He felt trapped between his family's desperate need for security and his own crushing sense of injustice. The mill didn't just consume steel and coal, it consumed men's dignity. The dangerous pact. The organizing efforts were driven underground, hiding in plain sight. They met not in taverns, which were full of company spies, but in the dark, cavernous basement of the Slavic Hall on the edge of town, under the guise of Mutual Aid Society meetings. 2 days later, Janek descended the rickety wooden stairs into the humid basement. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and quiet desperation. About 40 men were gathered, Poles, Slovaks, Italians, the common laborers, bound by a common grievance. Leading the meeting was William Z. Foster, or rather, his local surrogate, a young, fiery Slovak organizer named Miro. Miro wore a thin suit and a look of permanent vigilance. He was dispatched by the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers, the union coalition pushing for the industry-wide strike. "They say we are disorganized cattle." Miro's voice was a low, impassioned rasp that had to be contained within the thick walls. "We will prove them liars. We are not just Poles and Croats, we are steel workers." He laid out the strategy. The date was set, September 22nd. The demand was simple: recognition of the union, the 8-hour day, and a living American wage. They have the militia, they have the guns, they have the newspapers that call us anarchists, but we have the strength. Every furnace in this valley will go dark, every open hearth will cool. We will show them that without our hands, their steel is only dirt. Janek saw the hope, intoxicating and terrifying, on the faces around him. He also saw the fear. A heavy-set Italian man named Rocco stood up, his face etched with worry. "My cousin, he was fired from Homestead for asking for more soap in the washroom. If we strike, the company will bring in the Negro strikebreakers from the South. They will put us on the street and they will forget us." Miro addressed the point head-on. "They will try to divide us.
They will use every trick, race, language, religion. We must stand together. If they bring in new men, we must meet them not with rocks, but with brotherhood. We must show them this fight is for every man who bleeds in the mill, black, white, or immigrant.
The air was electric. As the men signed their names or made their marks on the Union pledge cards, a palpable sense of unity solidified. When Miro reached Janek, his pen trembled slightly. This was the point of no return. He was choosing justice over immediate security, a fight he might not survive over a peace that was slowly killing him. He signed his name, Janek Kowalski. The act felt heavier than shoveling 10 tons of ore. The days of decision. The weeks leading up to September 22nd were a nightmare of anticipation. The mill floor, already a place of danger, became a crucible of psychological warfare. Foreman O'Malley's once casual insults turned into menacing interrogations. "Heard your friend Piotr got himself a new pair of boots, Kowalski," O'Malley sneered one afternoon, his eyes narrowed. "Expensive boots. Did the Bolsheviks buy 'em for him? Maybe he's planning a little trip back home?" Piotr, who stood nearby, kept his gaze fixed on the furnace, his jaw tight. A few days later, Piotr's shift was arbitrarily cut. The message was clear: dissent led to starvation. The local newspaper, owned by interests aligned with the mill, ran daily, screaming headlines. "Foreign agitators plot revolution. Strike is communist plot to sabotage American industry." The pressure on the families in 5th Street intensified. Janek and Zofia fought constantly, her fear clashing violently with his rising sense of moral purpose. "The grocer told me that if the mill closes, he will not give credit. Not to any of us. How will we feed Clara?" He held her, smelling the ever-present soot in her hair. "We will be paid more than ever before, Zofia. We will have 8 hours to be a family. We fight for the future of Clara." But the doubt was a corrosive acid. He watched men waver, their resolve cracking under the weight of debt and fear. Then came the ultimate sign of the owner's power. On September 18th, 4 days before the strike, Piotr was called into the office. He returned an hour later, his face gray, his dinner pail empty. "Fired," Piotr managed, his voice a broken whisper, "on the grounds of insubordination and subversive activity. They gave me nothing. My family has 4 days. The firing of Piotr, a good, quiet man, was a hammer blow. It was designed to shatter the fragile courage of the common laborers. The owners were calling their bluff. Janek looked at the massive, indifferent bulk of the steel mill, the furnace glowing like a hungry, malevolent eye. He thought of his son, Jurek, the ghost he saw only in sleep. He thought of the dignity that had been stripped from him piece by agonizing piece over 5 years. He met Miro that evening, his resolve finally ironclad. "Piotr is an injustice. It cannot stand," Janek stated. Miro nodded grimly. "The fight is bigger than Piotr, Janek. It is bigger than Carnegie. The whole country is watching. We strike in 4 days. You must be the one to tell the men on the open hearth floor. If they walk, the mill stops." Janek agreed. His life, a simple sequence of work and survival, was about to be irrevocably changed. The hour of decision was here. The morning of the Great Steel Strike. September 22nd, 1919. The sun rose not over Carnegie, but into the thick industrial haze. It was a Monday. Janek's heart pounded, a furious tribal rhythm against his ribs. He had not slept.
He walked past the quiet, fear-filled faces of 5th Street. Zofia stood in the doorway, her hands clasped. She did not speak, but her eyes held a desperate plea.
He simply kissed her forehead, a promise he might not keep hanging unspoken in the air. He arrived at the gate, clocking in for what he prayed would be the last 12-hour shift of his life. The tension was suffocating. Every foreman, every plant guard was watching. The mill felt less like a factory and more like a fortress preparing for siege. On the open hearth floor, the heat was already unbearable. Janek found his crew, the Slovaks, the Italians, the Poles, working with a deliberate, unnatural slowness. They knew. At exactly 10 a.m., a shrill, piercing whistle, not the company's, but one carried by an unseen organizer near the gate, cut through the roar of the machinery. It was the signal. Janek looked at the roaring furnace, a river of fire consuming all in its path. He looked at O'Malley, standing 50 yards away, his hand near the holster of the revolver he now openly carried. He then looked at his comrades. He remembered Piotr, the 8-hour day, and the face of his sleeping son. He dropped his shovel. The heavy metal clanged loudly on the steel floor, a sound that, in the chaos of the mill, was an unmistakable call to action. He spoke loudly, in a mixture of Polish and broken English, his voice hoarse but clear, cutting through the steam and the roar. Enough! He stepped away from the furnace. A Slovak named Tomas dropped his charging bar. An Italian named Luigi turned off the steam valve on his ladle. One by one, the common laborers of the open hearth floor stopped. The rhythmic, pounding heart of the mill faltered. O'Malley let out a howl of pure rage. "Kowalski, get back to work, now! You're fired! All of you! Get out, you communist trash!" Janek stood firm, his black, soot-stained hands open and empty. "No more, Mr. O'Malley. We go home now. We come back when you recognize the union. The furnace, it sleeps today." Then Janek led the way. He walked past the foreman, past the stunned faces of the few skilled workers who hesitated, and toward the gate. As they streamed out, a wave of noise erupted, not the mill's roar, but the rising sound of men's voices, cheering and shouting in a dozen different languages, all agreeing on one single word: strike. Janek stepped out of the mill gate and breathed the outside air. It still tasted of soot, but for the first time in 5 years, it also tasted of freedom. The great steel strike had begun in Carnegie, Pennsylvania. The fight for his family and his dignity was now fully engaged. The story is now approximately 3,000 words long. The remaining 500 words will focus on the immediate aftermath of the walkout, the ensuing violence and company retaliation, Janek's role in the conflict, and a brief, impactful conclusion to his personal struggle within the larger historical event. The silence that fell upon the Edgar Thomson Steelworks was the loudest sound Janek Kowalski had ever heard. It was a cessation of the deep tectonic groan that had defined his adult life, a breathtaking, frightening vacuum. The first day of the strike, September 22, 1919, saw nearly 350,000 steelworkers across 10 states walk off the job, with the Pittsburgh district, including Carnegie, hit hardest. The furnaces went dark, the rolling mills stood still, and the colossal engine of American industrial power ground to a halt. The sheer unified power of the immigrant common laborers, long dismissed as interchangeable units, was terrifyingly evident. But the company, the monolithic U.S. Steel, did not pause. Their response was immediate, brutal, and comprehensive. The very air of Carnegie shifted from being heavy with soot to thick with menace. As Janek and the other strikers gathered near the mill gates, a line of fresh-faced, heavily armed Pennsylvania State Police, the infamous Coal and Iron Police, formed a rigid barrier.
Behind them, trucks rumbled in carrying the first wave of strikebreakers. These men, often impoverished African Americans recruited from the South with promises of high wages and secure housing, were deliberately used by the company to ignite racial animosity and shatter worker solidarity. Miro, the young organizer, stepped onto an overturned crate, his face pale but resolute. "Remember what we agreed. No violence, no hate. We are workers. They are workers." Janek, standing beside the Slovakian organizer, watched as the striking Poles and Italians, their anger palpable, began to jeer and shout epithets at the oncoming workers. The company's plan was working perfectly. The police, meanwhile, ignored the strikebreakers and focused only on the strikers, their clubs resting menacingly in their hands. "The newspapers call us anarchists," Miro yelled, his voice cracking. "We are only asking to be seen as men. Do not give them the violence they need to crush us." Janek quickly moved forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Tomas, the Slovak. Speaking in a forceful blend of Polish and English, he appealed to their higher purpose. "We fight for the 8 hours, not for the right to throw rocks. Save your strength. We are the majority. Let the mill be empty. Let the furnace cool." His intervention, bolstered by Tomas and others, diffused the immediate confrontation, but the air remained volatile. The battle for the mills had shifted into a war for public opinion and physical control of the streets. The home front and the scourge of fear. On 5th Street, the strike brought an immediate, chilling scarcity. Zofia's initial fear turned into a grinding anxiety. The rent, due at the end of the month, was owed to a company subsidiary. The grocer, true to his word, cut off credit. Janek, no longer tethered to the mill, worked tirelessly for the strike effort. He and Miro organized soup kitchens in the Slavic Hall basement, funded by meager contributions from the National Committee and often by the self-sacrifice of the workers themselves. Zofia, seeing her husband's dedication and the communal support, reluctantly began to participate, cooking and distributing food. The shared hardship, ironically, was forging the very community the company sought to dismantle. But the repression intensified daily. The Pinkertons were everywhere. On the 3rd day of the strike, Miro was arrested under a vague charge of incitement to riot and hauled away. The local magistrate, a longtime associate of U.S. Steel, set his bail impossibly high. The head of the local strike committee was gone. The mantle of leadership, by default, fell to men like Janek and Tomas. They became the visible faces of the strike in Carnegie, traversing the cold, quiet streets to maintain morale. One evening, Janek returned to find Zofia distraught. 2 men in dark suits had visited, flashing badges. They said if you do not return to the mill by Saturday, they will report us to the immigration office. They said, "We are a burden on this country, Janek, that they will send us home," she sobbed. The threat of deportation, the ultimate weapon against the foreign-born worker, was the cruelest blow. Janek held his wife, his mind racing. They were not just fighting for a wage, they were fighting for the right to remain in the only place they had left to call home. The turning point: violence and vengeance. The company, frustrated by the sustained walkout, escalated their tactics. On October 12th, they decided to force the issue. A group of striking Italians, led by Rocco, who had expressed doubt in the basement meeting, were picketing peacefully near the mill's secondary entrance. Without warning, a squad of armed coal and iron police, accompanied by Foreman O'Malley, charged the line. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Janek, nearby, organizing the distribution of leaflets, heard the shouts and the sickening thud of clubs on flesh. He ran to the scene. He found Rocco lying on the muddy ground, his head bleeding profusely, barely conscious. O'Malley stood over him,
a triumphant snarl twisting his face, his club slick with blood. "That's what happens to rats who stop working!" he roared, kicking dirt onto Rocco's fallen body. He spotted Janek. "Kowalski, you're next, you damned hunky!"
A primal, incandescent rage, hotter than any open hearth, seized Janek. He saw not just Rocco, but Pyotr, fired and shamed, his son Yurek, unseen and neglected, and the fear in Zofia's eyes. This was the true face of the furnace. It demanded submission or death. Janek did not hesitate. He picked up a heavy piece of slag iron from the ground, a dead metallic weapon. As O'Malley took a step toward him, Janek hurled the slag with all the force of his steel-working years. It was not a clean shot, but it struck O'Malley's arm, dropping the heavy wooden club with a sharp crack. O'Malley howled in pain and fury. The other police, momentarily distracted by the unexpected retaliation, hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The strikers, witnessing Janek's defiance, surged forward. They didn't fight the police, but they grabbed Rocco and pulled him back, surrounding him protectively. The police, outnumbered and unsure how far they were authorized to escalate, eventually backed off, dragging the cursing O'Malley with them. Janek stood on the spot, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a worker, he was a combatant. His act of resistance, desperate and violent, became the rallying cry of the Carnegie strikers. It was proof that they would not be beaten into submission. Long, cold retreat. Rocco recovered, and his beating solidified the resolve of the workers, but resolve alone could not feed their children. As the strike stretched into weeks, then months, the brutal economic reality began to take its toll. The National Committee, fighting dozens of simultaneous battles across the country, ran out of money and resources. The company, virtually limitless in its wealth, imported thousands more strikebreakers and housed them in barracks built within the mill walls. They used the compliant national press to demonize the workers, painting the entire movement as a red plot. By January 1920, the strike was breaking. One by one, the furnaces flickered back to life, manned by the new, desperate, and non-unionized workforce. The workers of Fifth Street, their savings gone, their children hungry, faced the impossible choice between starvation and surrender. Janek, Tomas, and the few remaining leaders held a final grim meeting in the cold Slavic hall. "They won," Janek said, the words bitter ash in his mouth. "They won with money and guns. We fought with our bare hands." Tomas shook his head. "They won the battle, Janek, but the war is not over. We showed them we can stop the steel. That knowledge is a new kind of power." On January 8, 1920, the National Committee formally called off the Great Steel Strike. The workers had lost the immediate fight. The heat retained. Janek Kowalski returned to the Edgar Thomson Steelworks a week later. The humiliation was a deeper pain than any physical injury. He passed O'Malley, whose arm was still in a sling, and who greeted him with a venomous smile. "Welcome back, Kowalski. Start cleaning the slag pits, and remember who feeds you." Janek did as he was told. He was back to the 12-hour day, the same crushing wage, the same suffocating soot. The mill had won. Or had it? As he shoveled the cooled slag, the hard, useless residue of the molten process, Janek looked around. The air was heavy, but the old comfortable arrogance of the foreman was gone. They watched the immigrant workers with a new, wary respect. The company had crushed the strike, but the silence of those 3 months spoke a profound truth to the titans of American industry. The steel they built was forged from the collective will of the men they despised. The immediate demands were lost, but the strike was not in vain. The sheer, unprecedented scale of the walkout, documented in national reports, exposed the horrifying working conditions. Though they didn't get the union, the pressure of the national outrage, spurred by men like Janek, forced a change from the top. Within 2 years, under government pressure, U.S. Steel and the industry finally, and quietly, began to phase out the brutal 12-hour day, replacing it with the 8-hour shift. Janek Kowalski never became rich. He continued to work in the furnace, his hands remaining scarred and stained, but he eventually saw more of his son, Jurek, who would grow up knowing his father, not just the exhausted shadow who slept off the mill's long turn. The furnace of Carnegie, Pennsylvania continued to roar, but the men who fed it had changed. They had tasted solidarity, and they knew their collective power. Janek, standing before the blinding heat, no longer saw just a prison. He saw a memory of defiance. His defeat was the slow, unyielding spark that guaranteed the eventual victory of the next generation. The steel strike of 1919 was not a triumph of the Union, but a necessary, fiery baptism, a warning that the age of unchecked corporate tyranny was drawing to an end. The metal was cold now, but the heat of rebellion once kindled in the hearts of the men on Fifth Street would never fully extinguish. It was retained, like the deep, latent warmth in a massive cooling ingot, waiting for the next hammer blow to release its transformative power.